YouTube.
Yep, I can see it on X, and I think we are there on YouTube as well. We're good to go.
Cool. Yeah, I'm seeing it as well.
Hi guys, welcome to another session of Healthy X Sundays podcast,
Yep.
where we bring you the most actionable and actionable information on different aspects of health. I'm your host Dave from Mind Muscle Project, and with me is my co-host Kunal Jain, the Veg Diet Coach. And today we have a special guest, Mr. Andrew Penella from US. Welcome, Andrew. So,
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Andrew's going to be speaking on longevity. We are going to cover longevity today.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Right. So, Andrew, first thing, uh, tell us about your journey. How did you get into this whole thing?
So I started developing an interest in longevity and just generally health and wellness. It was probably about 10 years ago. I had dealt with a bunch of injuries. I was dealing with chronic inflammation. I was overweight. I was feeling just really not my best. And so after I went through a couple of surgeries, I ended up getting knee surgery a couple times. I got hip surgery on both hips. I kind of looked in the mirror one day and was really just so frustrated. I'm like, what is going on with my body? And that led me to, because I was bedridden at the time, recovering from hip surgery, my only option was to start reading. And so I just started devouring books on all different aspects of health and longevity. And it allowed me to uncover things that I hadn't heard going to doctors and seeing specialists. And those are the things that I started to embed in my life. I started to find common themes, whether they were like thinking frameworks or habit-based systems around diet or exercise or stretching, mobility, whatever it was. And when I started to see amazing results in my own life, I ended up losing over 50 pounds. And then the following year, I put on a bunch of muscle. I feel significantly better now. My levels of energy, my happiness, everything has really gone through the roof. And during the process of doing all that, I just developed this really strong passion for learning this stuff, trying to synthesize what matters most, and then educating others or even working one-on-one with others to help them implement it and sort of personalize it for their life. To me, there's really nothing more fulfilling than helping others go through their own challenges, especially having gone through it my own. So that's what got me here today. And I still retain that habit almost every day. I wake up before the sun comes up. I spend a solid 20 to 30 minutes reading. I spend a solid 20 to 30 minutes reading about some health or wellness or longevity related topic. And then I spend multiple days a week creating content, coaching folks. So yeah, that's a little bit more about how I got to where I am now.
Right. So, what kind of clients do you mostly deal with?
Most of my clients are, I would say, middle-aged to older men that feel like they have put on weight. Maybe they were former athletes, or at one point in time, they felt really strong and mobile, like a lot of vitality. And they've just kind of let their bodies and minds slip a little bit, not intentionally by any means, really just by way of kind of losing sight of some of the fundamentals. So usually I'm working with guys anywhere from ages, I would say 35 to even upwards of 60. And I'm focused on helping them implement really healthy systems that work with their existing lifestyle. And most of the things we work on are things that I cover in my content. And I would say even like as far as foundational pillars, understanding nutrition, movement, stress, and sleep, those are four really key areas to be hitting the basics. And once you do, the results tend to just work themselves out. So yeah, I primarily work with, I would say, again, 35 to 60-year-old men, but there's women I've worked with. I've worked with couples. And across different social medias, there's people of all kind of ages and genders that I interact with. And I really just try to respond to everybody that asks me questions and, has certain things they're going through. I like the fact that, so for the last, for 10 years, I worked in the software space, and this was more of a personal passion of mine. And then a couple of years ago, I shifted gears. I launched my own coaching business. I became a personal trainer, a nutrition coach. And now one of the greatest things about what I do on a daily basis is whenever somebody comes to me with a problem, if I don't already know the answer, I get to go and research it and learn more about that specific topic. And so every time I'm interacting with somebody new or faced with a different challenge that I'm trying to help somebody with, it gives me a really cool opportunity to go and learn more about that. And it just has allowed me to develop this very sort of holistic, well-rounded perspective on the human body that continues to develop.
Right. So speaking of your content, one of the posts that caught my attention was you put out something called 20 lessons in longevity. It has sleep, stress, some of the things which you mentioned, nutrition, metabolic flexibility. So we would like to go deeper into this. Could you just tell us the most important aspects?
Sure. Yeah. Well, if I had to drill it down to 4 things, it would be what I just mentioned: nutrition, sleep, stress, and movement. And then in the 20 lessons in longevity, that was my effort to drill that down even further. Because for some folks, they may have trouble falling asleep, but then once they're asleep, they don't have trouble staying asleep. Or they may feel like they maintain a healthy weight, but they have anxiety. So there's so many different elements to even those 4 categories that those 20 lessons that I've put out, and I have like a free download on my website, those are really the 20 content areas that I am always researching and always learning more about, and finding that that's where the solutions really are to almost every problem that I have, helped a client come across.
Right. So one of the key aspects without a doubt is nutrition. So how do you look at nutrition? There's so many diets, there's so many mindsets and so many diet protocols and everything. So what if you had to pick one, or what is your approach to nutrition?
So if I had to pick one, it's something that I remember. I hear Robert Lustig talk about this all the time. He is a pediatric endocrinologist out at Stanford, and I've read a couple of his books. I've listened to him on a number of different podcasts, and I love the way that he simplifies nutrition, which is really by working backwards. So he explains it as you basically have 2 goals with nutrition, and it's feed the gut is goal number 1, and protect the liver is goal number 2. And I would even expand on protect the liver to protect your organ systems. The liver just tends to be one of the more heavily impacted organs from our nutrition choices. But when you expand it to organ systems, obviously you want to protect the liver, but you want to protect your brain, you want to protect your limbs, your circulatory system. Every organ is impacted. So if I had to synthesize nutrition down to 2 goals, it is feed your gut, goal number 1, and protect your organ systems, goal number 2.
Right. So we can't really put a name to the diet.
Well, I think we try to put nutrition in a box all the time. You have so many different people talking about different diets and what's worked for them, and everybody's a little bit different. So, you have the ketogenic diet crowd, which I'm a huge fan of elements of the ketogenic diet. Being in ketosis is something that as humans, we were meant to do on a, daily or at least every other day basis. You have people that are more the vegetarian crowd. And for a lot of folks, reducing saturated fat, even though, there's been a lot of new research coming out explaining, cardiovascular disease through a different light, not necessarily, pinpointing saturated fat as the enemy, which is, I think, for the last few decades been the most common theme there. But there are folks that are more genetically predisposed to cardiovascular disease from a high saturated fat diet. So those are instances where pursuing more of a vegetarian or Mediterranean style diet may be more beneficial. Then you have people that are in the carnivore crowd. And for a lot of folks that have autoimmune conditions that react strongly to some of the anti-nutrients or this sort of plant toxins in a, that you would consume in a vegetarian-based diet, the carnivore diet works amazing for them. So there's really no one size fits all. It comes back to like, what are the goals you're trying to accomplish? And if you're finding that based on your blood work or how you're feeling that a certain diet works really well for you and it's leading to you feeling like vibrant, a lot of energy, clear-headed and strong, that's what you're going for. So again, I don't necessarily subscribe to one diet. I'm always working backwards. What are the outcomes that we are going for here? And if you find the diet that works for you, who's somebody else to tell you that that's right or wrong? What I will say is, if I had to summarize one single diet that everybody should be eating, it's just a real food diet. So avoiding ultra processed foods, anything beyond like minimally processed dairy, like cheeses or milks. The ultra processed food, I think, is like the real culprit to a lot of the chronic diseases that we have today. So if I had to pick one diet, it would be the real diet, the real food diet, but all the other diets really fall underneath that.
So since we are on this subject, what kind of a diet, what does your diet look like? What do you have?
I found that eating a really well-rounded diet is what works best for me. I went through a phase where I did really strict vegetarian for a few years, and I ended up losing a bunch of weight, but I got to the point where I started losing muscle mass. I felt very low energy, and I really just kind of figured out it wasn't working well for me on a consistent basis. So I started adding in more meat, and now I eat a diet that's full of meats, vegetables, fruits, and there's legumes like beans and chickpeas. But it depends on any given day. So I prioritize my meals around a couple different components. I try to eat fermented foods every day. Again, we're working backwards here. We're trying to feed the gut is priority number one. So I try to eat some form of fermented foods every day. That might be kimchi. I've recently taken a stab at making my own kimchi. I'm not quite there yet, but kimchi is really good. Sauerkraut. Fermented yogurts or milks, or sort of minimally processed milks and cheeses that maintain a lot of the healthy bacteria, which is how you feed your gut. So fermented food is one component that I try to add into my diet every single day. When it comes to macronutrients, I really focus on protein and fats. So I try to eat roughly 1 gram per pound of my body weight, which is I'm roughly 185 pounds. So I try to get anywhere from 160 to 180 grams of protein per day. And so I end up supplementing with a protein shake. It's a lot easier to get that number. With that, I eat eggs pretty much every day. Avocados, I really am a big fan of. But as I said, not every day is the same. So I may have 4 days a week where I have, meat, and then another day or two where I have fish. I may have another day where I fast for 24 hours. I've really tried to develop a better feel for my body. And I think part of that comes from having this, surgeries and injuries where I've become very sensitive to what I eat. So ultimately, every day is a little bit different, but one of my main priorities is fermented foods. Another main priority is protein. And then I would say the last piece that I'm very mindful of is my eating window. So how often I'm eating throughout the day. I typically intermittent fast until about noon every day. So roughly speaking, 16 hours fasted, 8 hours eating. But if I have a weekend where I've indulged, I may do a 24-hour fast. If I've been really good for a few days, I may not fast. I may eat, especially if I've done a hard workout the day before, I'll probably eat at 9 or 10 a.m. just to make sure my body's refueling. So that's another thing I think is really key for a lot of folks is maintaining their eating window and making sure that they're cycling between days where they maybe eat a little bit more protein and more carbohydrates and days where they give their body a little bit of rest to burn through existing energy.
Right.
That's
Kunal?
very interesting, Andrew. So I wanted to ask you, it's been like a 10 years journey for you where you have lost around 50 plus pound of weight. And what's been the evolution? Like you said, you started with a vegetarian diet and then you added more meats to it. So what do you think a person who's starting now and wants to improve their health, what kind of changes a typical person would see in their diets and in their exercise regimen? How many times do people need to adapt to different challenges which come?
So I'm a big fan of, life is really a never-ending journey. And so how many times somebody needs to adapt really just depends on what they're going through. But there's a possibility you just never stop adapting and you never stop growing, and you never stop learning. And right now I am 34 years old. If you ask me in 10 or 20 years what my diet looks like or my exercise routine looks like, it's probably going to be different than what it is now, just because my body will process food differently and react to exercise differently. So for anybody starting out now, for a lot of folks, the metabolism is, I think we live in an age where the vast majority of folks have some degree of metabolic dysfunction. So they may be dealing with weight that they have trouble getting rid of. They may be just feeling low energy or fatigue. And so when that is what somebody's trying to solve for, one of the first things I recommend people do is explore intermittent fasting or the eating window, because the culprit to metabolic dysfunction is usually too much food. Throughout history, humans evolved to be basically perfect specimens of storing energy. And now we have too much energy. And so evolutionarily, it's not as consistent for a lot of folks that have access to these highly processed foods that are very high in calories and carbohydrates. So for anybody that's dealing with any degree of metabolic dysfunction, so again, weight gain or low energy, I always recommend starting with some degree of intermittent fasting, just to allow the body to cleanse itself. And you don't need to be extreme about it. I think for most folks, starting with like a 12-hour fasting window where if you eat your last meal at 6, you don't eat again until 6 a.m. So you avoid the late night snacking, and then trying to adjust that continually to get to a roughly 16-hour window where if your last meal is at 6 at night, your next meal is at 12 or noon the next day. I find that that's enough time. And there's tons of people there's a bunch of different forms of intermittent fasting, but I think that's probably the most accessible for people. And you don't get to the point where you're really like that hungry. Your hunger hormones tend to adjust over time. So intermittent fasting has been a major piece to my journey, and pretty much every client that I've worked with that's dealing with some degree of metabolic dysfunction, intermittent fasting is just such a helpful tool. It's also a fairly simple tool because you're not tracking calories. You're not even trying to avoid any specific food groups necessarily. You're just managing when's my last meal and when's my next, when is my last and first meals. The other component that, again, I went through a phase where I went full vegetarian, and then now I have added stuff back in. I think that approach can be really helpful for people as well, to start with a more restrictive diet where they're eliminating a number of things, especially if they're dealing with inflammation to some degree, where maybe they have some chronic pain or again, they're feeling very low energy or fatigue. Eliminating certain food groups and then slowly adding them back in, it allows you to identify which food groups might actually be leading to the issues. So I'm a huge fan of balance now, but the journey was not always that way. I was fairly extreme at first, limiting myself to just basically green vegetables, and then slowly adding things back in to find which things made me feel less energy or made me feel like I was starting to get bloated or gain more weight again. So that's what I would recommend for anybody starting out. It's using your eating window because it's incredibly simple, or some form of intermittent fasting, and starting with a fairly strict strategy of eliminating things and then adding them back in really just gradually.
Right. So I was on the podcast yesterday and I'm having a deja vu moment right here when you were talking about intermittent fasting, because that's been instrumental even in my journey to lose 25 kilos. So, and it's such an accessible and a free method for everyone to explore. So it's amazing. And in terms of, while we cover nutrition, what is your take on supplementation? Because micronutrients also sometimes are found less in people.
So supplementation is something we could probably do an entire podcast on just that topic.
Right.
I am a fan of minimalism when it comes to supplements because unfortunately they're expensive and so they're not accessible to everybody. But I do think that there's a time and a place for certain supplements. And like, I'll give the example of one thing that I personally found was helpful. So when I was vegetarian for a couple of years, one of my biggest struggles after I had lost a bunch of weight was just low energy. And I decided to try supplementing with creatine because I wasn't getting enough creatine in my diet because it's primarily from animal or meat sources. I started supplementing with creatine and I noticed an almost immediate difference in my energy within a week or two. And so that kind of turned on the light bulb where started asking myself, maybe I do need to eat, be eating more eggs again or eating more meat again. And so for those that are, choose a diet for other reasons that maybe, their religion or for whatever reason, if somebody, for example, decides to be vegetarian, then it can be helpful to supplement with certain compounds or nutrients that you really only get in animal sources. So things like creatine, B vitamins tend to be much higher in animal sources than vegetarian sources. Omega-3s, like supplementing with some form of fish oil can be helpful for folks if they're not getting enough fish or they're having too many omega-6 fatty acids, the more inflammatory form of fatty acids in their diet. So that's a long-winded way of saying I am a fan of supplements to a degree. There's a time and a place. I think if you eat a really well-rounded diet that involves plants, so vegetables, fruits, some, animals, dairy, you're going to cover a lot of your nutritional bases. But if I had to name a couple of supplements that tend to move the needle for people and be really helpful, creatine is one, omega-3 fish oil is one, vitamin D is one, because so many of us work inside all day, and vitamin D it's not even a vitamin, it's a hormone. It's the only vitamin out of hundreds of vitamins that we can't produce, that we can produce ourselves. And so if you're not getting enough sunlight or enough vitamin D in your diet, that influences your mood, it influences your metabolism, your immune system. And so again, there's a time and a place for supplementation. The last thing I'll say, which Dave, you brought up, is for our cognition and our mood and our mental health, we're constantly manufacturing neurotransmitters or hormones like dopamine, serotonin, even like cortisol, adrenaline. And those hormones are strings of amino acids that get built in our bodies using nutrients, things like iron and magnesium and vitamin B6. And so for some folks that are genetically predisposed to creating less of those hormones, supplementing with specific nutrients can be super helpful. There's a whole field that I'm very excited about called nutrient therapy, and it's for mental health, and it's for people that may have higher levels of anxiety or depression. That's largely because genetically they're not producing enough of specific hormones because they need more of these nutrients. So that's something, again, we could probably do an entire podcast on just that. But I'm really excited about nutrient therapy as a field because it basically what they do is they look at your genetics to determine, oh, you might need 200 times more vitamin B6 than the person next to you to produce the same amount of serotonin, which is your happy hormone. It makes you feel content. So that's something that I think I'm really excited about that field.
Very interesting. So, one of the things that's closely tied with longevity is fasting, as you mentioned. So, people assume when we say longevity, people automatically assume it has to be a long fast. It has to be 1 week. It has to be 5 days. So, what is your take on this extended fasting?
I think there's a time and a place for extended fasting. And one area it seems to be very promising for is protection against and even treatment for cancers. Because your body, when you don't eat, and we're talking about 24 hours or more, where you may be doing a 2-day, 3-day, I mean, people do 7-day fasts. Your body goes into all out survival mode when you stop eating for that long. And on one hand, there are certain things that are not super beneficial, like you may start to eat away at some of your muscle mass. But on the other hand, your body is really cleaning house. So it's going through and it's trying to identify any cells or tissues that may be, malfunctioning or not working at their best. And it's actually going to recycle them. It's going to break them down and use them to rebuild other tissues. And so, I mean, every single human on earth has cells that, replicate irregularly and produce like precancerous cells. But when you have a healthy immune system, your body takes care of that. So that happens every single day in every single human. But what intermittent fasting does, the longer term fasting, it basically makes your body zoom in on the situation and try and find like where are the irregularities taking place. So I think longer term fasting can be a really powerful practice for preventing cancers, or even folks that are dealing with cancer and maybe going through chemotherapy. Fasting seems like a very promising combination with chemotherapy. Another thing that fasting does that I find really interesting, so cancer cells use significantly more glucose than regular cells. There's a malfunction when cancer cells develop that I think I've read anywhere from 18 times to 300 times more glucose, and they don't use fatty acids. Their fatty acid metabolism is broken. And so when you basically starve yourself with fasting, you actually selectively starve out cancer cells, because normal cells can run on fats, no problem. Cancer cells can't. And so that's another reason that fasting, I think, is such a promising lifestyle treatment for cancer prevention or cancer treatment. The other thing, so shifting gears a little bit, I do think that it's a really powerful tool for weight loss. Obviously, when you don't feed yourself, your body's going to start burning through the existing energy you have stored as fat. But for folks that are a healthy weight and healthy metabolism already, that's where I'm not sure fasting beyond maybe 2 or 3 days is really necessary. So I'm a fan of doing a 2-day or 3-day fast one time a year. And it's really for the cancer sort of protection and benefits that come along with it. It's really just a cleanse. So I am a fan of doing that once a year. I'm somebody that's not trying to lose any more weight. So that's why I try to be really mindful of that. But for folks that are trying to lose weight or gain better control over the metabolism, doing a multi-day fast, even a couple times a year. I mean, I have a few guys I work with that they have 50 pounds to lose. And some of them really like fasting. They find that it's just really simple. It's easy for them to use. And so I have some of them that want to do 48-hour fasts twice a month, where they do 2 full days where they don't eat anything, and they'll do 24-hour fasts once or twice a week. So it depends on the individual, but I think fasting is just a really promising lifestyle intervention. The thing that I think is really important for people to know is making sure you're eating enough protein is probably the most important thing that you should pair with fasting. So when you're done with your fast, eating plenty of protein to make sure that you are protecting as much of your muscle tissue as possible. Muscle tissue is really our insurance policy when we get into older age, to make sure that we can move around, we're not feeling pain, we're strong, we can lift things like our kids or grandkids. So protecting muscle is the number one priority when you're thinking about fasting. Making sure you're getting enough protein to protect that muscle is huge.
Right. So before we move on to the next session, I just want to ask one last question about, since you mentioned protein, uh, is there such thing as excess protein, and does it, like, there's some theories out there that if you have more protein, then it will affect your longevity to certain pathways. So what is your thoughts on this?
So there's some contention around how much protein we can digest in one sitting. For a long period of time, everyone was being told, or the research suggested, that we really couldn't digest more than 25 to upper end of maybe 40 grams of protein in one sitting. There's been some recent research that's come out that suggests that if you have a higher protein intake, you're not going to digest all of it. But let's say in one sitting you had 60 grams of protein. Some of this newer research suggests that your muscle protein synthesis, so the amount that you are growing your muscle tissue and rebuilding, stays elevated for longer when you have the higher protein. So it seems like this new research is now suggesting that 25 to 40 grams, we actually may be able to digest more than that in one sitting, because our bodies keep that elevated level of muscle protein synthesis for longer. Now, when it comes to longevity, one of the main debates there involves a pathway that it's basically an on-off switch. You have your growth pathway, your mTOR, and then you have your sort of recycling, repair pathway, AMPK. I won't get into like the science behind it, but I'll just explain that when you fast, you activate the repair pathway. So AMPK, or the recycling pathway. That's what tells your cells, we're low on fuel. It's time to go find the least efficient cells and recycle them. mTOR, the growth pathway, is what stimulates new building. So new muscle protein synthesis and new construction. And so the fear through the lens of longevity around eating too much protein is that if you have the mTOR pathway activated too much, if there are these cancerous cells that your immune system misses, you're going to allow them to grow and proliferate and multiply faster. So that's where the balance comes into play between, on one hand, you're growing, on one hand, you're repairing. Protein stimulates the growth pathway. So that's also why I think the balance between something like intermittent fasting and protein intake is so important, because when you're eating protein, you're growing. When you're fasting, you're repairing. And so having it swing back and forth is really important. But mTOR, the growth pathway, is stimulated by more than just protein too. So that's why I think if we're eating too much and people are just consuming excess calories, you're always stuck in that growth mode, which is also why I think we've seen rising rates of cancers, and because people they're never allowing their body to go into repair mode and their immune system to really come into overdrive.
Right. So there's this interesting theory out there. I believe it's called Soma theory, which says that when your body can either pick between the growth one or the repair one. So if you're going full out on growth and performance, it suffers on longevity. And if you're going full out on longevity, it might hamper your performance. Or I think that's something you would agree with, more or less.
Yeah, when we're talking, so when I think about longevity, I think about three things really, but two primary: how long you're going to live and how well you're going to live. I think you could probably extend your lifespan by doing extreme intermittent fasting and eating a very low protein diet. At least some of the research suggests that. But your quality of life would probably suffer because you'd lose a lot of your muscle tissue. You probably would feel weaker not necessarily less energy. You'd probably have energy, but you would feel weaker, like just unable to pick things up as much, especially when we're talking, again, real longevity for the centenarians out there that are 100 plus years old. Protecting their muscle tissue is so important for their quality of life. So that's where, in my mind, you have the length of time and you have the quality of time. And true longevity, my opinion only, is finding the balance. I don't want to live to 100 years old if 90 to 100, I can't even pick up my grandkids or, get down on the floor and play a game or think straight. So it's really that balance of quality and length that I think is important. And I do think that if you're seeking out just pure longevity, it's hard because you probably sacrifice a little bit of that quality of life, a little bit of that strength and vitality by doing extreme intermittent fasting or, again, restricting your diet. So that's my opinion. I'm sure there's an argument to be made for both, but that's kind of how I think about longevity. And the third component I didn't really mention is happiness. So your mood and your quality of life. Like if you're somebody that really enjoys, making a drink at home, an alcoholic beverage, and when you get older, let's like my grandfather, who's almost 100 years old, but he's basically like, I don't want to live any longer if you're not going to allow me to have my glass of vodka at the end of the day. So if that makes you happy, then that's something that needs to be in the factors when you're thinking about longevity and your quality of life.
Right. Kunal,
Right. So very interesting, Andrew. What is your take on while fasting? Do we need to have water, or it should be like a water fasted fast?
I definitely think you should drink water when you're fasting. I don't really see any health benefits from not drinking water when you're fasting. I mean, there are a bunch of different forms of fasting. Some is just a water fast is usually what I recommend. Maybe adding in a little bit of salt just to give yourself some electrolytes. Some people like to do like a bone broth fast, for example, where they just drink bone broth throughout the day. Some drink, it's like a vegetable broth fast. So it's up to you. I think in general, if you're doing some form of a eating window with the daily fasting, not super extreme, you're going to get a lot of the benefits regardless.
Right. And just one thing on whey isolate supplementation, especially for vegetarians, do you think it's okay to take some kind of a protein supplementation, or we should go natural?
I do. I think it's hard to get the amount of protein, and this is a lot of self-experimentation. So I have noticed that there is definitely a threshold where I lose muscle if I'm not consuming a certain amount of protein. Now, there are days when I make sure I consume more because I have exercise. So I'm a big fan of weight training. I don't go to the gym, but I have kettlebells and I love doing like dumbbells or kettlebells. And when I'm weight training, I know that I'm actively tearing my muscle tissue and need to give my body more complete proteins. So on those days, I will definitely do a whey protein shake. And I used to do a vegetarian protein shake that was pea protein, but as I learned more, I realized I just wasn't it's harder to digest than whey protein. So I wasn't getting I would eat the same amount of protein, but then digest less of the vegetarian. So I do think that supplementing with protein can be really helpful. It's more important when you're doing strength training or weight training, which I think everybody should be doing like twice a week. But so there's a time and a place for protein supplementation. But if you're eating a lot of eggs and meat and dairy, you're probably getting a decent amount of protein anyway. So it's especially important, I think, if you choose a vegan or vegetarian diet, to find some way to get more protein.
Right. Yeah, I think the next segment is all about exercise. As you said, strength training at least 2 times a week is important. And is there a, a sort of protocol for strength training which, depending on your age, can be suitable for like anyone?
I'm a huge fan of body weight exercises to start. So anytime I have a client that hasn't done any weight training or strength training in over a year or two, I always start them on a body weight circuit first. And it may be as simple as just doing some body weight, some air squats or some push-ups, or I mean, there's a bunch of different, I have a whole sort of library of resources that are exercises that I'll send people. But as far as a starter plan for strength training, body weight is the starting point. Definitely. You want to make sure your form is good. You want to make sure you can do exercises like a squat without pain. That's a huge priority. You should be able to exercise and do strength training without pain, aside from when you start to add weight, actually feeling like there's strain, but not pain of your joints. The next, I would say, tier of that is adding in some form of weight. So having a dumbbell or a kettlebell, even an exercise band. I mean, you could do anything. I'll do body weight squats with my baby daughter in my hands when I'm taking care of her, just because for the sake of time. So adding in some form of weight, what that does is it triggers your muscles. It sends a signal to them to say, we need to get a little bit bigger. We have to prepare for this weight that we're dealing with right now. And so I think it's really important, especially as we get older and we lose, I think, 1% of muscle mass every single year past age 40. I just read something on this. And so it's just really important to do some degree of weight training. I would say 2 times a week. If you're doing heavier weight, you can do less. But like body weight, I usually recommend people doing at least 2 to 3 times a week. And it doesn't have to be super complicated. It could be in a given day, throughout the day, just saying, I'm going to do 100 squats today and 100 push-ups, and then 100, dead bugs or bicycles, something to get kind of more of the core, or 10 minutes of planks throughout the day. So you can get creative with it, especially if you have a busy schedule. But I think having 2 to 3 days a week where you're really trying to get the body weight or the strength training is important.
All right. So another thing you mentioned in your 20 lessons is flexibility plus posture, right? So how does this feature in this? Like, what is your take on this?
Flexibility and mobility and posture is super important, especially as we get older. And unfortunately, our muscles just become less pliable. We become more dehydrated. So when I think about what's the perfect exercise routine for longevity, we strive for perfection. We're never going to get there, but this is what I would strive for. 2 days a week, doing some form of strength training, 2 days a week, doing some form of cardiovascular training. So even just walking quickly or running or bicycling or rowing machine, something that's focused on cardiovascular activity for 30, 40 minutes. Then at least 1 day a week, probably 2, that you're focused on flexibility and mobility. So that may be something like yoga. It could be different forms of balancing. In order for your muscles to function properly and your joints, they have to be able to go through a full range of motion. So doing stuff like yoga is going to make you much stronger. People, I think, overlook that when they think about strength training. It's going to make you much stronger when you're lengthening the size of your muscles. And so flexibility has to be part of the routine. If it's not, you end up putting yourself at much higher risk of injury. And I say that because I did that to myself, where I exercised almost too much, got injured a bunch of times, didn't realize it was because I was not doing any mobility or flexibility training. And so now I try to do yoga once or twice a week. I just have a yoga mat. I just get down on the floor. I do it for 15, 20 minutes. And I've been doing it long enough that I can feel it out. But it's great that there are guided videos that people can go through that are on YouTube or just online. There's a bunch of different resources that are free for people. So all that to say, I do think the flexibility and the mobility need to be part of the routine. The other pillar that I would add, so we talked about strength training, we talked about endurance training or cardiovascular training, talked about flexibility and mobility. The last piece is stability, which I mentioned when I talked about balancing. But when we exercise and do forms of strength training or even flexibility work where we're stretching, a lot of times we're only targeting the biggest muscles. So you may get down on the floor and just stretch your hamstrings or your quads or your piriformis muscles or your glutes, but we're not often accessing the really small stabilizer muscles that are super important for things like walking up and down stairs or preventing yourself from falling over when you step on an uneven surface like a curb or a rock when you're walking. And so adding in 1, maybe 2 days of some form of stability training can be really helpful. That may be as simple as even a plank is an example of stability training. And if you did that on an uneven surface, that would add more stability to it. So I think having some form of stability training that you're incorporating in your week, whether it's 1 day or 2 day, it just ends up helping you exercise all those tiny muscles that protect the bigger muscles and your joints.
Right. So one follow-up question is, so as somebody gets older, should they concentrate on, say, specific exercises or specific type of movements, or they should mix it up and do a lot of variety?
I think as you get older, it becomes more important to focus on strength training and stability and flexibility. Because when you do strength training, or for a lot of folks, cardiovascular training, things like going for a run, that becomes less feasible as we get older, just because we don't want all of the impact on our joints. So doing some form of strength training to protect our muscle mass, even if it's farmer's carries, where you're just holding 2 dumbbells or kettlebells in your hands and you're just walking for a minute or 2, and you're doing that 5 to 10 times, that's still going to signal to your body that it needs to protect your muscle tissue. The reason I would rank stability and mobility, or flexibility and stability, over cardiovascular training is because you end up getting a lot of cardiovascular exercise when you do the strength training or when you do the stability training, and protecting those small stabilizer muscles becomes increasingly important as we get older. I think I read recently that falls, so for elderly folk that fall and break a bone, that's in the top 5 leading causes of death. It might be as high as number 2 in the United States. So protecting yourself from falling, again, if you're exercising your stabilizer muscles and you're staying flexible, when you step on a stair unevenly or someplace where you might fall, chances are higher that you're going to protect yourself from falling. You're going to catch yourself. So I think that becomes extremely more important as we get older.
Right. So, coming to the next section, which is like nature. You're talking about sunlight, hydration, all that stuff. So, what is its role? What is its role? It's not something people would, obviously people know sunlight for vitamin D, but they don't know more into this. Like, what is the role of, being in the nature?
So that is a great question. And it's something that I talk about all the time because it's one of the things that I've noticed most powerfully in my own life. Being outside, getting fresh air, getting sunlight, taking some time to feel the ground, look at the plants and the trees and the wildlife is such a powerful contributor to longevity because of what it does to the body. So we talked about sunlight, super important for vitamin D, also really important for your hormone production. So again, vitamin D is a hormone, but also hormones like dopamine and serotonin, your mood hormones, cortisol. When you are outside and you're exposed to natural light, the light helps reset your brain and your circadian rhythm so that you feel more alert, you feel more focused, you have a better mood. So especially morning sunlight is super important. Late in the day, sunlight starts to tell your body it's time to wind down. So being outside, even for 5 to 10 minutes, a couple times during the day, can really help your body adjust to the normal cycles of the days and the nights. So you're having better energy, you're sleeping better, you're waking up more refreshed. Obviously, fresh air is super important. Right now, I think a large percentage of the world, myself included for the last 10 years, live in urban areas where unfortunately, there's just a lot of pollution. There's a lot of car exhaust or brake dust. And so getting outside and getting some form of fresh air is really important. And I also read a study recently about the comparison between indoor air and outdoor air. And even inside, when we're inside for too long, there's just a lot of dust. There's a lot of stuff that, is in our homes that is helpful for us to get a break from. So being outside, getting fresh air. And then I think, one of the things that I've noticed, again, most powerfully in my own life is green space. So getting outside and getting in touch with the ground. I mean, there's a whole practice called grounding where you get in touch with the earth, and the earth's magnetic field actually helps reduce inflammation in your body. But the impact that even just looking at trees or green space, plants, animals has on your blood pressure, on your levels of stress, your cortisol, and your adrenaline is really pretty profound. I think it was in the 1980s that in Japan, they were noticing that there was really high rates of suicide and depression among the working population of people going into offices all the time. And so they started with this practice called nature bathing or forest bathing. And they would send office workers out into these camps, basically in the woods, to live in the woods for a few days. And people would come back feeling like they had totally lost sight of what life was about and how connected humans are to nature. I think that's one of the main reasons that nature is so powerful. So many of us are day to day, we're working all day, we're eating, we're trying to exercise, we go to sleep, we do the same thing over and over again. It ends up with us losing sight of the fact that we're just another part of nature. Yes, we're an amazing species. We've developed this cognitive ability to think about ourselves and complex problems. But at the end of the day, we are still part of nature. And so being outside amongst nature helps remind us that all of us are not going to be here someday. And so when you have certain problems or things that are stressing you out on a day-to-day basis, they should all be taken through that context. So that's why I think for me, it's been so powerful is I am constantly driving myself to do more, to help people, to create content, to do a million different things. I have tons of goals I want to accomplish in my life, and it can sometimes stress me out. I'll wake up very early in the morning feeling like I have so much to do. Going outside and spending 10 minutes, no distraction, just thinking about life, looking at the trees, just really grounds me. It reminds me that, wow, okay, there's a much bigger picture here, and I can't lose sight of that. Worrying about whatever I was worrying about for that day, it's not as important as remembering like we're all just a part of Mother Nature. So I think that's so helpful. And that's part of the reason it drops your blood pressure, makes you feel less stress, it lowers inflammation. It's a really powerful tool that I think a lot of people don't use enough.
Right. So to add on to this, two other things we should be avoiding as per your list is environmental toxins, and secondly is electromagnetic radiation. So a bit on this as well.
So I mentioned the toxins that we experience in urban environments. There's also a lot of toxins in our homes, just because when we manufacture things like fabrics or plastics, clothing, most things are manufactured with some forms of chemicals or that end up being toxic at high doses. And that's not meant to scare people. Our immune systems are amazing, so they take care of the majority of it. But I think makes it really important to also give your body some breaks. And that's part of the reason that being out in nature is also so beneficial for your immune system, because that's the environment that our bodies evolved in. We didn't necessarily evolve to be surrounded by, like, covered in polyester, plastics and interacting and drinking out of plastics every day. And so it's something that nobody's going to avoid entirely. Like I'll drink out of plastics occasionally. It's impossible. It's everywhere. It's just something I think is important to be mindful of, because there are certain folks out there, some that I've worked with directly, that they end up having issues where maybe it's fatigue, maybe it's headaches, And for some people, it's a buildup of toxins in their environment that have come into their body. And so doing a cleanse or just being more mindful of what in their home might be contributing to them taking on toxins can be the solution to that for them. So I've worked with a couple people that have felt like I'm hopeless. I've tried everything. I eat super clean. I've done all these things. What's going on? And it ends up being toxins. There's also, unfortunately, a fair degree of heavy metals that are in certain foods, especially ultra processed foods. And so for those that eat a very high ultra processed food diet, the accumulation of these heavy metals can lead to, again, things like migraines or constant brain fog or really low energy. So I think it's really important to be mindful of that too. But I'll reiterate, our bodies are really good at cleaning themselves. So it's not something to stress out about. It's just something to be mindful of. And I think one of the best ways that we can deal with toxins is to drink clean water whenever possible and to sweat. Sweating is one of the most powerful ways to cleanse your body. So making sure you're sweating at least a couple times a week. And when I say sweating, it's not like you're little sweating. I mean, like your shirt is drenched. You're actually really sweating a lot. That is a really powerful cleansing tool. And that's one of the main reasons that we do sweat. The other thing, electromagnetic energy. This is a controversial topic because people love their convenience. I'm sitting here in front of a computer. I have my phone. I have monitors. So most of us are, especially those that work in front of a computer or in an office setting, we're surrounded by electromagnetic devices. We want to be able to use our phones. We want to be able to call people. And so the level of convenience that it offers makes people really weary about any negative side effects it might have because we don't want to give up that convenience. But I do think that it's important to be mindful of your electromagnetic environment because on a cellular level, humans are just big solar batteries that, like, everything in our body, all of our cells, we're constantly like exchanging electricity and magnetic charges. Every single molecule in our body is held together with electromagnetic charges. And so to think that something that emits that much radiation as a computer or a phone wouldn't impact that, I think that's naive. And I was that way for quite a while, saying this is not impacting me. But as I learned more, and I've actually used some of the devices that can measure electromagnetic frequencies, and there is no doubt that there is a lot of them coming off of technology. So the solution to that is similar to the toxins. You're not going to avoid them entirely. I still use my phone and my computer every day, but I try to give myself times during the day that I distance myself from technology. And that could be paired with something like nature. So I love the concept of habit stacking, where I check off multiple boxes at once. When it's nice weather out, I'll go outside with a kettlebell when I have a break from work. I'll get sunlight, fresh air, nature, exercise, and I'll get myself away from technology. So being able to check off all those boxes at the same time ends up being really efficient. So getting outside is a really powerful way to get away from electromagnetic radiation to a degree. I mean, now there's, in a lot of urban areas, there's cell phone towers everywhere. The other strategy I think is really important is the bedroom, because when your body goes to sleep, that's really the most important time for you to repair and recharge. And if you have your phone right next to you, especially a lot of us sleep right next to our phones with it like next to our head, that's a lot of radiation to be dealing with when your body's trying to repair itself. And so I typically recommend that people at least keep their phones on the other side of the room, or they turn it on airplane mode. Your alarm still works if you need an alarm to wake up. If you really have an emergency or somebody that needs to contact you, that's a scenario where you might want to have your phone on, but on the other side of the room, just so it's not right next to you. So there are little things that we can do in our environment to help our body maximize our ability to repair, protecting us from toxins, protecting us from electromagnetic radiation. They're things you're not going to avoid entirely. You shouldn't stress out about them, but they're important to be mindful of.
Yeah, wonderful insights, Andrew. And all these gadgets we have, like computers and mobiles, they do have a lot of EMF. But then, what's your take on other devices like grounding mats or red light lamps for people who don't have access to sunlight, or it's the winter season, or they don't have access to a patch of grass? Do you think these kind of tools are effective?
I do, but I think that there is a lot of low quality products out there. So I think the technology and the concept is absolutely there, but there's so much hype around these things that it gives people the opportunity that may be disingenuous to create grounding mats that don't work, or red lights that aren't even the type of red light that stimulate your mitochondria and they're beneficial.
Right.
So I think there's definitely a time and a place, but it's important to do research and make sure that if you are going to use a grounding mat, that it's actually been tested and somebody with the measurement tool has hooked their tool up to it, and they've shown that it actually does ground out the electromagnetic or the excess electrons. The other component, the red light, there are certain wavelengths of red light that impact our body, specifically our mitochondria, in a beneficial way, but it's not the full spectrum of red light. So it's important to do the research there. There's a couple different wavelengths. For me personally, I've used 670 nanometers. I know that that is one of, I think, 4 or 5 that have shown to improve the efficiency of your mitochondria, to help you produce more energy, to lower inflammation, to increase repair. So I do think there is there's a place for red light supplementation or grounding mats, but you just have to do your research and make sure they're high quality resources, because it's so easy to say, hey, here's a red light, this is going to be beneficial for you, and you try and use it and it may not be doing anything.
Absolutely. And coming to the other point of hot and cold exposure. So I'm thinking taking cold showers in the morning, or once in a while taking a sauna bath. Do you want to expand on this particular topic?
Sure, this is definitely one of my favorites. I think it's one of the most powerful tools that we have for our health is just the temperature that we're living in. And obviously we all like being comfortable, right? Most people don't want to be uncomfortable, but having short periods of discomfort, very similar to exercise, serves as a form of stress that actually makes your body stronger and more relaxed afterwards. So it's called hormetic stress. Exercise is an example. Intermittent fasting is another example. Even sunlight is an example. Too much sunlight is a bad thing. It's too much stress on the body, but short periods, very beneficial. The same goes for hot and cold therapy. So there's been a ton of research showing that sauna usage, it reduces all-cause mortality, risk of cardiovascular disease, inflammation. It improves circulation, brain health, cognition. There's a ton of research about the sauna, and it actually is really compelling in the sense that the longer or the more times you do it, the better the benefits are. So even doing it one time a week has a positive benefit on all of those things I just mentioned and more. But doing it 2 times a week is even better than 1, 3 times a week is better than 2. It's really pretty incredible as long as you're not overdoing it. So for most people, if they go into a sauna and it's 180 degrees Fahrenheit, they probably will stay in there for 20 minutes, really until you feel like you want to get out. And then you try and stay for like an extra 3 to 5 minutes, because that's where a lot of the benefits come in. And then an hour later, you'll notice your body is super relaxed. You feel very calm. Just going through that period where you're more stressed. If this is your baseline, you go through that period where you're more stressed, and then afterwards your baseline's here. So you've dropped your baseline a little bit. And that's really where a lot of the benefits come in, is you just feel a lot better. It's similar to exercise. So that's the heat. It kind of mimics exercise. A lot of the same benefits. The cold is a totally different animal. It tends to be much more uncomfortable. It has similar benefits as far as our ability to deal with stress. So when you go into the cold, whether it's a cold shower or a cold plunge, or you're just out in the cold for a little bit, it's uncomfortable on your body, and your body responds by afterwards upregulating your immune system. For guys, it can boost testosterone afterwards. Testosterone, it can boost dopamine and serotonin. So a lot of your hormones that keep you focused and alert and happy. So as far as a protocol for cold therapy, I recommend people when they take their shower, at the end, do 30 seconds of cold water and then build up. If that feels, manageable after a week or two, build up until you're doing 90 seconds or 2 minutes. And it does have a lot of benefits. Reducing inflammation is one. So if you have any form of injury, it can be really helpful for reducing pain. And that lasts for like 3-4 hours afterwards. It also increases your metabolism. So the cold stimulates a form of fat in your body that actually burns calories to keep you warm. And so by doing regular cold exposure, you can increase your metabolism and end up burning more calories and more fat passively. So you don't really have to do anything else. Even a minute in a cold plunge or a cold shower will actually increase your metabolism for a few hours afterwards. And over time, it increases your metabolism sort of permanently unless you were to stop doing it. It also increases your immune response. So your immune system sort of gets a boost. The only thing you want to be sure of is if you're doing cold therapy, you don't do it when you're sick or when you're feeling chronically stressed or overwhelmed. It's a preventative, protective tool. But if you're already at the point where you're super stressed or you're sick, the cold is going to push you over the edge and you're going to end up it's going to make it worse. So I love both the hot and the cold for different reasons, but they're very powerful ways if you have access to them to improving your health for different reasons.
Absolutely. And one interesting thing on the list is breathing. I think a lot of people do shallow breathing or they just breathe through their mouth. And I've been guilty of doing that. And it really, when you start consciously breathing through your nose, it really makes a difference. And I want to know your thoughts on breathing, like from your perspective.
Yeah, well, unbeknownst to me, I learned at some point that the breath is really the only tool that you can use to influence your autonomic nervous system, meaning we have our nervous system that we can influence. So like blinking, that's something that you can take control over. But digestion or your heart rate, those are things you can't influence directly. The breath is something that we do subconsciously that we can also take conscious control over. So that's what I mean when I say it's the only autonomic function. It's the only function that happens automatically that we can then suddenly take control over. Again, we can't just like consciously sit there and increase our heart rate, but we can do that with our breath. So the breath is such a powerful tool for regulating the nervous system. And as you said, breathing through your nose is something we were meant to be doing just based on how our nervous system responds. It keeps us in a more relaxed, calm, and focused state. I think a lot of us subconsciously, myself included, have gone for a long time just breathing through our mouth, shallow breathing, not really consciously thinking about the breath. And when we breathe through your mouth, you stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. So your fight or flight response, it activates your brain. It makes you feel more of that stress, like you're ready to fight or you're ready to run. And when you do that around the clock, that just makes you feel burnt out. You end up getting exhausted, feeling like you're stressed slightly more stressed all the time. And so the nasal breathing is a really powerful way of just keeping your baseline nervous system in a more calm and relaxed state. And I also love sort of breath work. So using different forms of counting to manage your breathing. One of my favorites is called vagus nerve breath work. And basically what you do is you inhale for a certain number of seconds. So you inhale for 4 seconds, you exhale for 8 seconds, and then you hold for 8 seconds on the exhale, and you keep doing that. If you do that like 10 times, your entire body just feels like it's melting. It just relaxes to an unbelievable degree. And it doesn't have to be 4, 8, and 8. It's really just however long you inhale, you exhale for twice as long, and you hold for twice as long. So if you're used to mouth breathing, you may do like 2 seconds and then 4 seconds and 4 seconds, or 3 and 6 and 6. But that's one of dozens of different types of breath work that are really powerful for calming your body down. There's also different forms of breath work that can really energize you. So I think the breath is just an amazing tool. And whenever people ask me, where should I start? It's just nasal breathing, consciously nasal breathing throughout the day, trying to focus on deep exhales and deep inhales, not breathing super shallow.
Awesome. I just love this list, 20 lessons in longevity. It's so comprehensive, Andrew. I mean, there's so much to ask. And
I appreciate that. That's something that I've worked on that probably took me 10 years to come up with those 20 categories. And I wasn't really even intending to. It just so happened that every time I was faced with a problem, whether it was myself or a client or like even a family member or friend, the solution always came down to one of these, or multiple usually, of these 20 things. And so this just became a list that I had put together, and I realized this really covers everything. And most of the things on there are very accessible. They're either free or they're pretty low cost. They just involve discipline, they involve habits, systems, and lifestyle. So no, I appreciate that.
you're right. Everything, it's like an interplay of these different things, like sleep and stress and what we eat. Everything is covered here. And anything you want to touch upon in this list, which we might have missed in our discussion so far?
So one thing that I think is really important that unfortunately not enough people prioritize, at least people that I've interacted with, is the mindfulness and the meditation and the emotional control piece. And I think part of that is just we live in a more stressful time. A lot of people, again, like people are they have their careers, they have families, they have kids. They're really trying to accomplish so much and balance so much, and it's overwhelming. And so the reaction to something like mindfulness or meditation often gets the response of, I do not have time for that. And the people that say they don't have time for that are the ones that need it the most. And ironically, it ends up giving you time back in your day. When you implement a practice like meditation or mindfulness, you are so much more productive, you're focused, your mood is better, you are just feeling higher levels of energy throughout the day. Your brain works better. And there are plenty of studies to back this up. They've done brain scans. They show that the brain is younger when you're actually spending time to meditate or do some form of mindfulness. So I guess I'll summarize it just by saying, I think it is incredibly important that people spend at least a couple minutes a day getting to know themselves better. And one of the best ways to do that is mindfulness and meditation. And it's one of those things you can pair with nature. Like if you go spend 10 minutes outside, acknowledging, like you're looking around, you're soaking in the nature, recognizing what sort of thoughts are popping into your head is a really powerful practice to get to know yourself better and to develop better emotional control. Our emotions dictate the way we think and ultimately the way we act. So if you're trying to improve your life, I always tell people every battle that you face in your life is first won or lost in your mind. Everything else is downstream. And so spending time to practice mindfulness and some form of meditation and get to know yourself better is just super important.
Right. So we talked about all the things which are under our control. So what about genetics? How big of a role does it play?
This is something I get asked about a lot by clients because there's so much information about it. And I'll start just by saying 99.9% of humans, 100% of humans share 99.9% of the same DNA. So we are all almost identical on a genetic level. The difference that we see in our day-to-day lives where somebody may be more overweight, somebody may be more anxious, somebody may be like a type A versus a type B. A lot of that stuff is downstream of the second layer to our genetics. So we have the first layer to our genetics. That's 99.9% the same across all of us. Then we have a second layer that you can think of like a series of light switches or doors. So like you don't get access to your full genetic footprint underneath, but the lifestyle choices that you make are what's going to allow your body to access the different genes in your DNA. And so you can have the same exact, like I may have an identical twin that is 50 pounds overweight because the choices that he makes are activating different sections of his genetic footprint that aren't activated in me because of the choices that I'm making. So I won't go any more down the rabbit hole there, just to say that we have so much more control over our genetics than we think. Our daily lifestyle choices make a huge difference on that second layer, which is called epigenetics. And I think for a lot of folks, that's really empowering. Like you have more control than you think. There are definitely certain diseases out there and people are predisposed to certain things, but for the most part, you have so much control. And I think we've almost become disenfranchised being told that like your genetics are playing a huge role, and they play a role for sure, but you can turn on and off your genetics. There are genes in your body you can turn on that dramatically lower your risk of diabetes. There are genes you can turn on that dramatically increase your risk of diabetes. Your choices influence how those switches are turned on and off.
Right. So one person just messaged me, ask about Brian Johnson. We can't we can't go discussing longevity. And what are your thoughts on such experiments? And
So I created a video on my YouTube channel talking about Brian Johnson's longevity blueprint. And I think there's two components to it. On one hand, I think it's very interesting. He is definitely pushing the envelope. He is trying to figure out, can we optimize the human body and extend lifespan to a point that we've never seen before? On the other hand, most of what he recommends, it's not even that he's recommending it, but most of what he practices is just wildly impractical for the average person. And so when he talks about the 100 different supplements that he takes and his own supplement mixtures and things like that, that's the only thing that makes me raise an eyebrow. And part of that's because I'm kind of a minimalist in that area. I feel like there are so many lifestyle interventions that we can use that are either no or very low cost that can improve somebody's health, that resorting to supplementation or really expensive therapies and blood infusions, that should be the last thing that we get to. And many people can't afford that. So I think it's cool what he's doing. I'm definitely following along. But I think a lot of it just isn't super practical. And I'm always very wary of how are you empowering people? Or are you disempowering people? Because if you're out there and you're promoting this longevity blueprint and people feel like, wow, I got to spend, $200 a month or X number. I mean, he spends like $2 million a year, I think. For a lot of people, they're like, well, I guess I can't be healthy. Like my fear is like making people feel that way. Whereas I'd rather be empowering people to be like, these 20 things are pretty much free and they can dramatically improve your health. And so that's my take on Brian Johnson.
Apart from Brian Johnson, what's your take on like research by some Japanese scientist, Yamanaka, talking about stem cells and cellular reprogramming? Do you think there is merit in it, or it's just another commercial thing going on?
I think there's a combination of both. So I try not to fall into black and white thinking ever, because that's a trap I think most of us fall into, because it's exhausting to try and uncover like what are the parts of this that work or matter and what parts don't. So I think in that case, there's definitely going to be people out there. They may even be in that category of trying to promote stem cell therapy, for the sake of generating profits, which is part of, research and development anyways. But I do think what they're doing is very cool. I'm actually not as familiar with it as I should be. I know who you're referring to, but I think stem cells and learning how to reprogram our own cells to act younger is a very promising therapeutic approach to longevity. There are a lot of ways that we can do that through lifestyle, but they're definitely pushing the needle they're moving the needle. So if somebody that's, 95 years old starts implementing some of those therapies and it starts making them act like they're 40 again, that's really cool. So I think there's definitely promising research being done in the field of stem cells, and that's going to contribute to longevity. I don't think we're probably still at least 10 years away from that being something that's commercially viable to the average person. 10 years might even be being generous.
All right.
So it's interesting. Similar to Brian Johnson. Very interesting. I think it's very important we're doing that research. I'm not sure how much that's going to be impactful for the average person in the near term.
Yeah. So, Kunal, I think you can wind it up if anybody has a question or if you have any questions.
Yeah, we have some people with us. If anyone wants to type in a question for Andrew, please go ahead. Otherwise, it's been a wonderful session. It's packed with so much information. It's like usually people just get stuck at metabolism, but this list, it's like it's amazing. It covers everything. So this has been a very, very informative session, and I really appreciate it, Andrew.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate you guys having me on. I love talking about this stuff. This is what I talk about across all my social media platforms. So on YouTube, most recently on X, I post about it on LinkedIn and Instagram. So I'm just constantly promoting different strategies to optimize your health in these 20 different areas. So that's really what my content's all about.
All right. So with that, thanks for joining us, Andrew, on the Healthy X Sundays podcast. We really appreciate having you here, and we look forward for another session on supplements or anything you like. It was wonderful speaking to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks again for having me. And I hope everyone that's out there watching this has an awesome weekend.